This is Aryan from EDD Academy, and this is the first lecture in the Introduction to Biology class. So let's start with a pretty big and important question. What is biology? Put simply, it's the study of life. And in that, let's dig a little deeper and figure out exactly what's meant by life. So obviously, you're alive. If you have any pets, they're alive. A rock isn't alive, but is a virus alive? Well, the characteristics of life are as follows. All life is made up of one or more cells. For example, a bacteria is only one cell, but you as a human are made up of roughly 10 trillion cells. Think of how amazingly large of a number that is. The current world population is 10 billion if we round up, which means that you have about 1,000 cells for every person on Earth right now. The next characteristic is that life grows and develops. This is pretty intuitive. If you've ever planted a seed or had a sibling or marked your height on a door frame, you've definitely noticed that all life grows at some point or another. All life also has organization. Your body is like an extremely efficient and well-structured machine. And this is due to the fact that all animals and life are extremely well organized. Every single one of your blood vessels or your nerves or any organ really is a complex, well-regulated, and highly organized structure made of cells that must be in the right place at the right time doing a specific job in the right way. And that's what's meant by organization. Now, you might be wondering, what about single-celled life? How is a single bacterial cell shaped like a blob organized in any way? Well, that blob, like bacterial cell, really has complex and once more well-organized machinery inside of it, which we'll get into in a later lecture. So the next characteristic of life is response to stimuli. A stimulus is really anything that the organism senses and responds to. For example, if you're hungry and you smell some food, that's a stimulus that you may respond to by going to get lunch. Or if a bacteria is swimming along and detects that the water is getting a little bit too salty to live in, it might turn around and swim in the opposite direction. All life also needs energy. This one is pretty straightforward. We get our energy from food, plants use photosynthesis to get theirs from sunlight, and there are even some bacteria that use iron to make energy. Anyway, if you deprive an organism of its energy source, it'll get progressively weaker and eventually die. The next characteristic is that all life should be able to reproduce with other members of its own species or by itself. And finally, all life maintains homeostasis. Homeostasis is the idea that your body normally exists in a certain stable state, and when something changes the state of your body, it'll work towards getting back to the base state it was in previously. For example, when it's really hot outside, your body naturally heats up, which takes it away from its normal base state. The body then responds to this by cooling off via sweating, which tries to bring it back to the base state. And finally, any entity that carries out life processes and is therefore alive is called an organism. Now, let's consider using this list of criteria we have whether a few things are alive. Starting with humans. Well, we are made of cells, we grow, we definitely have organization, we respond to stimuli, require energy, we reproduce, and maintain homeostasis. Alright, so what about a rock? Well, rocks are not made of cells. They don't really grow or develop, they don't respond to stimuli, they don't need energy, and they don't reproduce or maintain homeostasis, so they aren't alive. Alright, now what about viruses? So viruses aren't technically made of cells, but their structure is similar enough to a cell that we can kind of look past it for now. They also don't explicitly grow after they're released from an infected cell, but they do have pretty intricate organization. They absolutely do respond to stimuli, such as when they come in contact with a cell, and they obviously do reproduce as well. But they can only do so with the help of a host cell, which once more stretches the definition a bit. And they do maintain homeostasis to a degree. So is a virus alive? Many, including, I guess, most high school teachers, argue that they are not, because they really push the characteristics of life at best and break them at worst. But once I had a professor who's been in the field of microbiology for 40 years tell me in a class full of students that viruses are in fact alive. And the fact that such a simple idea is still a debate demonstrates that while biology is seemingly well understood, there's still much we just don't know. Alright, so that was a quick introduction to biology as a whole. Now let's move on to the first lesson of this class, basic biochemistry. So before we start to understand much of biology, there are a few simple topics in chemistry I'd like to go over. First of all, chemistry is the study of matter, and matter is really anything with both mass and volume. This means that you're made of matter, the Earth is made of matter, so is the sun and all life. You had the idea. And atoms are the building blocks of matter. And this is a representation of an atom you've probably seen hundreds of times, and while it's not technically accurate, it's good enough for the context of this class. This thing in the middle here is the nucleus. It holds pretty much all of the mass of the atom and contains positively charged protons and neutrally charged neutrons. There are also electrons, which are on the outside here and have so little mass that they basically aren't counted, but they do have a negative charge. Usually the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons, making the atom neutrally charged, but this isn't always the case. Now, electrons can be arranged into these separate energy levels, with the first one following the duet rule, meaning that it can hold up to 2 electrons, while energy levels 2 and up can hold up to 8 electrons, and this is called the octet rule. Something really important to remember are that atoms really want these energy levels to be full. And keeping that in mind, if we have 2 hydrogen atoms, they're going to have 1 proton and 1 electron each with no neutrons. However, they both really want to have that complete energy level with 2 electrons according to the duet rule. This results in something called a covalent bond forming. The 2 hydrogens share their electron so that each of them essentially has a full duet, and this forms the simple molecule H2, also known as hydrogen gas. Let's take a look at another example of bonding. If there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, well, the hydrogens still need 1 extra electron to fill their energy level, like we saw earlier, while the oxygen has 8 electrons. This results in 2 electrons in the first energy level, according to the duet rule, then 6 in the second energy level. And according to the octet rule, this second energy level really wants to be full with its 8 electrons. So 2 covalent bonds will form between oxygen and each of the hydrogens. This completes all the atom's electrons' energy levels, resulting in H2O, better known as water. Now, water is unique because while an electron is being shared across the covalent bond, it's really being shared unevenly. There's a lot of complex math backing this up, but basically oxygen hogs this electron, meaning that it spends a lot more time on the oxygen side of the bond than by the hydrogen side of the bond. And because the electron has a negative charge, this unequal sharing means that the oxygen side of water also has a slight negative charge, while hydrogen side has a slight positive charge. These very small charge differences are called partial charges and are denoted with a lowercase Greek letter delta, and then a plus or minus sign, as you can see here. So like all positives and negatives, these partial charges attract each other, resulting in water molecules forming bonds with each other and sometimes other surfaces. These bonds are called hydrogen bonds and are usually denoted with a dashed line if covalent bonds are a solid line. Alright, now that we've seen what hydrogen bonds are and why they form, we can take a look at their consequences. First of all, there's adhesion, which is hydrogen bonding between water and another surface. There's also cohesion, which is water forming hydrogen bonds with itself, like I showed you in the last slide. And then a combination of these factors results in capillary action, a really interesting phenomena in which if you have a very small glass tube and you put the tip in water, the water will actually climb up the inside of the tube all the way to the top, seemingly without any forces acting upon it. How does this work? Well, the adhesion between the inner wall of the tube and the water is stronger than the water's own cohesive forces. This is proven if we zoom in on the water level near the tube. You'll notice that the water forms this curved shape instead of being a straight line, and this is called a meniscus, and it's proof that the adhesive hydrogen bonding between the water and the glass is stronger than the cohesive hydrogen bonding between the water and itself. The next property of water we'll be looking at is its surface tension, which results in the fact that water molecules at the surface are forming fewer hydrogen bonds than the ones in the middle of the water. And this is why water forms nearly spherical droplets, and water striders, like this one, can walk on water. Water also has high heat capacity. This means that it takes a lot of energy to heat up water and a long time to cool it down. In fact, a calorie is defined as the amount of energy it takes to heat up 1 gram of water by exactly 1 degree Celsius. Now, a kilocalorie is the calorie you'll see on nutrition labels for like a protein bar, which means that for every single calorie on those labels, you could theoretically use the energy in that to heat up a single gram of water at 1,000 degrees Celsius. So that's just a crazy amount of energy. That is if you're using it completely efficiently, which it's kind of impossible to. Anyway, water is also often called the universal solvent because of its ability to dissolve a wide range of substances. This ability is once more due to water's partial charges, as many water molecules can surround and bind to a single positive or negatively charged ion or substance. Water also has a neutral pH, and I'm not going to explain the details of pH for this class because we won't really use it again, but just know that this means that it's safe to have in and around your body, as you should know. Alright, so by definition, an organic molecule is anything that contains carbon and hydrogen. Organic molecules are found everywhere in life, and carbon is always in their backbone. What makes carbon such an essential element in life? Well, unlike pretty much all other elements, it can bond 4 times. This is due to the fact that carbon has 6 electrons, so 2 of them fill up the first energy level according to the duet rule, and then 4 are left in the second energy level. Because of this, carbon needs to have 4 electrons shared with it to complete its energy level and be happy. Carbons can form these really interesting structures. For example, this is glucose, which contains a 6-member carbon ring, and this is a part of a fat molecule. And when there's an angle in this change without an atom specified, we assume that there's a carbon there. For example, at this point with the red box, there's a carbon bonded to 2 other carbons because there's 2 lines connecting that point to 2 other points. But that only fills up 2 bonds, so we also assume that the other 2 bonds are just carbon bonded to hydrogen. So this is our first poll question. Which of the following statements regarding a common molecule is correct? And just a reminder, polar means that it has a partial charge like water, while non-polar means it does not. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to pause the video and answer this, then I will go over all of the answer choices. Okay, now let's look at these answer choices. So the first one says that H2 is polar because the electron in the covalent bond is shared unequally, which doesn't make sense because hydrogen and hydrogen are the same atom, so they'll really hold on to the electron with equal strength. The next answer choice was that water is polar because hydrogen hogs the electrons in covalent bonds. So while it's true that water is polar, it's important to remember that this is because the oxygen hogs the electrons, not the hydrogen. So B is almost right, but not quite. All right, now C says that CO, or carbon monoxide, is polar because oxygen hogs the electrons in the covalent bond. And this is completely accurate, and therefore C is the right answer. Moving on to D, it says that C2H6, also known as ethane, is nonpolar because electrons are shared unequally in carbon-hydrogen bonds. So if you remember back to the last slide, I said that electrons are actually shared pretty evenly in carbon-hydrogen bonds. So while it's true that ethane is nonpolar, the electrons are not shared unequally. So D is also incorrect. All right, now we're going to move on to the major types of macromolecules. These are the 4 biggest and most important classes of molecules in any form of life, specifically carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. First of all, carbohydrates are used for energy storage and also structural purposes, and I'll get to the details of that in a minute. All carbohydrates have the same general formula of CnH2nOn. This means that there are the same number of carbons and oxygens with twice as many hydrogens. So if n equals 20, there would be 20 carbon atoms, 20 oxygen atoms, and 40 hydrogens. An example of a carbohydrate where n equals 6 is glucose. If we follow the general formula, we know that glucose is C6H12O6, and as you saw earlier, it can exist as a ring. Glucose is a great example of a monosaccharide or a single sugar. There are also disaccharides like lactose, which are made of 2 sugars. Lactose specifically is made of a glucose monosaccharide and a galactose monosaccharide. And then there is cellulose, which is what's called a polysaccharide. Polysaccharides are made of many monosaccharides, and cellulose is really just made of many repeating glucose monosaccharides. So like I said earlier, carbohydrates are used in energy storage and structure. The cellulose I just showed you on the last slide is a carbohydrate found in pretty much all plants, as it makes up plant cell walls. Plant cells are different than animal cells in the essential detail that they all have cell walls that protect them from the outside and provide structural support. This is why animal flesh is usually soft, while plants often form hard and unmoving structures like stems and trunks. Starch is how plants store energy, and it's also made of glucose, but this glucose is arranged in long branching strings that are easier to break down and access than the well-structured matrix of glucose in the cell wall. There's also chitin, which is found in arthropod exoskeletons. Arthropods are a pretty broad class of animals, including insects, arachnids, and crustaceans. They have no internal skeleton, so they can use chitin to provide structural support. Chitin is also found in fungal cell walls, which gives them enough stability to form structures like mushrooms. Finally, there's glycogen, which is comparable to starch, but it's found in animals instead of plants. It's basically a branching polysaccharide that's really easy for the body to break down and then use as an energy source. The next macromolecule I'll be going over are lipids. Lipids cover a really wide variety of molecules, all of which are hydrophobic or repelled by water. They include fats, oils, waxes, and steroids, and like I said, they're all hydrophobic and therefore are not soluble in water. Let's take a look at an example. This is a triglyceride, which is a type of fat, and here we can see that we can see why lipids are hydrophobic. There are a lot of carbon-carbon bonds and carbon-hydrogen bonds in these three long tails, and these bonds, unlike the ones in water, share electrons equally. Because of this, lipids and water can never form hydrogen bonds, which is what makes lipids hydrophobic. Also, these fat tails can either be saturated or unsaturated, with saturated tails having no double bonds and unsaturated ones having at least one. Lipids are generally used for everything from energy storage to cell membrane components to protection and insulation. The next macromolecules we'll be looking at are proteins. Proteins are polymers of amino acids, just like polysaccharides are polymers of monosaccharides. This is what an amino acid looks like, and you don't have to worry about knowing the structure or anything, just that the R group on the top can be any of these 20 combinations of atoms. This R group can be as simple as a single hydrogen or as complex as multiple rings, similar to the ones in glucose. So these amino acids are strung together to form a polypeptide like this, which then folds three-dimensionally to form a protein. Proteins are organized on a few levels. Primary structure is the actual order of amino acids. Secondary structures are a specific type of fold resulting from hydrogen bonding in anything other than the R groups. These can be either alpha helices or beta pleated sheets. That's not really important to remember though, so let's move on to tertiary structure, which is complex folding due to bonding between variable R groups in different amino acids. There's also quaternary structure, which is when multiple polypeptides come together to make a larger protein. So this is an example of what a protein looks like. You can't really see the primary structure, but these curls are alpha helices, a type of secondary structure, like I said. The quaternary structure is visible as the differently colored parts of this protein, each of which are different polypeptides. This protein is actually hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in your red blood cells. All right, the last macromolecules are nucleic acids. There are two types, deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA, and ribonucleic acid, also known as RNA. Just like the other macromolecules, nucleic acids are also polymers, but in this case, instead of monosaccharides or amino acids, they have nitrogenous bases. We'll be going over nucleic acids in a lot more detail in later lectures, so for now it's really just important to remember that they're made of many repeating nitrogenous bases. So you've probably seen an image like this before. This is a depiction of DNA, and as you can see, it forms this shape which we call a double helix. And the nitrogenous bases I was talking about are these things in the middle of the helix here. Now, there are 4 nitrogenous bases in DNA: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. Each are abbreviated with the first letter of their name, so that's A, C, G, and T. There's also uracil, which I'll talk about in a bit. So basically, if we think of DNA as a ladder, then each rung or step in the ladder is a pair of nitrogenous bases bound together with hydrogen bonds. However, only two pairs can form, guanine with cytosine and adenine with thymine. So if we zoom onto this section of the DNA and see that one strand has a guanine, then an adenine, then a thymine, and then a cytosine, we know that the other strand has to have the nitrogenous bases that match that, specifically cytosine, thymine, adenine, and guanine. Okay, so all of that was for DNA, so let's now take a look at RNA. RNA is almost always single-stranded. So if you can imagine only one of the strands in this picture, that's what RNA looks like. RNA also has a uracil instead of a thymine as a nitrogenous base, which means that there are AU base pairs instead of AT base pairs. There are also quite a few differences in the backbone, but that's not really important for now. Okay, now let's take a look at a sample question. If one strand of DNA has this sequence, which means that's like half of the ladder, what's the sequence on the other half of the ladder or strand? And I'll give you all a few seconds to answer, where you can pause the video, and then I'll go over the answer choices. All right, so the correct answer here is A. And the key thing to remember is that A bonds with T and C bonds with G. So if we take a first few letters of this sequence, we see A, G, C, T, and the matching bases would be T because it bonds to A, C because it bonds to G, G because it bonds to C, and A because it bonds to T. And from there, you can tell that the answer is A. Now you might notice that D is pretty similar to A as an answer choice, but it has U instead of T, and therefore it would only be found in RNA. And that about wraps it up for our first lecture in the introductory biology series.